I'm so happy to be here, and I'm grateful to the apparently numerous sponsors who put their budgets and resources together to bring me here. It's a great honor to be here, and very strange to be back at the place where I did my graduate studies, or began them many years ago. I was out last night with some faculty members who had been here when I was here, who kindly informed me that it was 28 years ago, which I found a daunting piece of information. But it's also a sort of homecoming, and I'm very happy to be here, and thank you all for coming. So I'm here to talk about translation and gas and studying with gas and things like that. And I thought, when I was invited to speak, well, I'm going to talk a little about inheritance and coming up. So here we go. Translating in rhythm with gas. I get asked a lot how I learned to translate, since I came up in the age before MFA programs and literary translation were as widely available as they are now. Two such programs actually existed back in the 1980s when I began my studies at the University of Iowa and the University of Arkansas, but I didn't know anything about them, and in fact, I wasn't even trying to get educated as a translator. I was working on becoming a fiction writer, and was also on the side studying German language and literature, because that was apparently what I did for fun. As an aspiring fiction writer, I found myself arriving on this very campus 28 years ago. Apparently I did the math the same way, where I studied with the late Stanley Elkin, the late Howard Nemerov, and the late Angela Carter. It's a very sad list. I'd also been particularly excited about the prospect of studying with William H. Gass, whose work I hugely admired. I had just come from Johns Hopkins doing an undergraduate degree in creative writing, where I studied with John Barth. I was obsessed with all things postmodern. I was crestfallen to learn that he refused to teach writing workshops of any sort, and those of you who are here in the morning have heard his explanation of why. There were lots of rumors about him circulating among the graduate students, all of them serving to create the picture of a literary giant. I heard a story about how he finished writing his first novel, Omensetter's Luck, placing the last page of the typescript on the neat stack on the desk in his office at Purdue University. This is how I heard the story. And then going out to lunch. When he returned, the manuscript was gone, purloined by an envious colleague. According to legend, he then rewrote the book from scratch. And I don't even know what you could say about a thing like that. I am pretty sure that I heard him saying once in person that he preferred teaching philosophy to creative writing and was never going to turn back. Yeah, he said, I'm going to repeat the thing that he said that was reported this morning. If I'm reading a bad undergraduate paper about Plato, at least I'm reading about something. I chewed on this sentence a lot as I revised and re-revised and re-revised my own stories before carrying them to the altar of the fiction workshop to be torn to shreds by Stanley Elkin, who liked to shout at me, "Follow the man," by which he meant that he found my fiction too meandering, too wannabe postmodern. It's very embarrassing to this day. The age of postmodernism had given way, and this is the end of the 1980s, to the age of minimalism, and I was behind the curve, behind the times, without, I fear, mastering the art of graceful retrograde. Meanwhile, I figured out that if I wanted to add William Gass to my list of professors, all I really had to do was just sign up for a philosophy class. So I did, and then William Gass taught me how to be a translator, which wasn't his intention, but it would not be an exaggeration to claim that his seminar entitled The Aesthetic Philosophy of Paul Valery was the single most influential class I ever took with regard to my education as a translator. The thing about studying Paul Valery with William Gass is that Gass spent the entire semester working on getting his charges to stop reading for content and start reading for everything else. Miraculously, my lecture notes from this seminar are still in my possession. Being a hoarder pays off. So I was able to reacquaint myself with some of the lessons it contained in preparation for this visit. Paul Valery, the great poet, essayist, philosopher, protege of Mallarmé, and called by some the last of the symbolists, was the perfect subject for this sort of study because he was unapologetically obsessed with form. A work that perfectly characterizes his aesthetic philosophy is his Eupalinos, or The Architect, ostensibly a dialogue between Socrates and Phaedrus in the afterlife, not the afterlife of the work in translation, but actual afterlife, discussing the work of a particularly perfectionist architect. Now, that was Eupalinos. Valery wrote this piece on commission for a French architectural journal that was so persnickety about its layout that he was told in advance the exact number of characters his piece was to contain. Not just words, but characters. And conforming to such a constraint suited him very well. Valery had no patience for undisciplined outpourings of the soul. He didn't even like novels, since they contained too much of everyday life, too much that was fortuitous, and were liable, and this is a famous quip that you may have heard before, to contain sentences like, "The Marquise went out at 5." Apparently the epitome of bad writing. The French novelist Claude Mauriac then went and wrote an entire novel with this title, "The Marquise went out at 5." As William Gass put it, he doesn't want words that have been like spit in everyone's mouth. That's how he talked in seminar. So Valery's works operate on discipline, not intuition, on cognition, not inspiration, or so it seems he wanted his readers, or at least maybe himself, to believe. He was much too intelligent a man to have been taken in by Edgar Allan Poe's claims about how the poem The Raven got written in Poe's essay, The Philosophy of Composition, but Poe's insistence that the poem was the result of a series of cool-headed calculations about how best to produce certain effects was so in keeping with Valery's own ideal of a rational poetics that he seems to have swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. I guess his therapist forgot to talk to him about denial. I don't know what I was thinking when I wrote this doc. I'm so sorry. He revised his own poems mercilessly, polishing each line to perfection. You won't be surprised to learn that Rilke, about whom more later, and there was more this morning, loved Valery's work and even translated some of his poems from French into German. Valery's love of aesthetic rigor and his fear of randomness and distraction, which makes him the opposite of Walter Benjamin, who is certainly also rigorous in his own way, goes so far that you might say that for Valery, a lack of rigor would constitute a moral failing. Gass invited us to consider the ways in which Valery anticipates the great Austrian-British philosopher of logic, mind, and mathematics, as well as language, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was 18 years younger than Paul Valery, in identifying error as a form of evil. Wittgenstein, in fact, turned out to play an important role in the seminar that Gass taught on Paul Valery, because an important part of Gass's program was to convince us of the essential role played by how something is said in what is said. It's not that a message is just a piece of information that exists in advance of its embodiment in words. The words shape it, and the way they shape it has a powerful effect on how our understanding of it works. A key sentence in the seminar, was the first line from the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, the one book that Wittgenstein published during his lifetime, Die Welt ist alles, was der Fall ist, which in English goes, the world is everything that is the case, or the world is all that is the case, depending whether you prefer the Ramsay Ogden or the Piers McGuinness translation. I'm not going to spend time attempting to explicate this difficult sentence that sets up Wittgenstein's complex argument about the logical structure of language and the relationship of language to the world. If you really want to know a lot more about that, you should go visit Professor Gass and ask him to talk about it, because that's a better idea than hearing my explanations. There's the sentence in German if you want to see it. Does the angle of the screen is it visible from over there? Okay. But for a moment, let's think about the ways in which this sentence is more effective in German than in English. The world is everything that is the case. Let's face it, this is a pretty bland-sounding statement about the world. Unless you're a logic junkie, your mind may have started glazing over even as I was reading the sentence out. How much thought did you give to it? In German, on the other hand, the sentence is sexy, svelte. It almost rhymes. It nearly falls into tropees. Die Welt ist alles, was der Fall ist. Keep in mind that trochaic meters lend themselves particularly well to weighty and serious phrases, such as once upon a midnight dreary. In short, the very sound of Wittgenstein's sentence is already going quite some way toward convincing us that what it is saying is both important and true. The beauty, symmetry, rhythm, and sense of balance in the sentence themselves function as part of its argument. Beauty is a form of truthiness, if you will. And that's an important thing for a translator in the making to understand. For Valery, the music of a line of poetry is the metaphorical body of the meaning of the line, following that same convention all of us are always using, pretending that meaning is something that can sit in a sentence as in a container. And of course that isn't quite right, and he knows it isn't right. Form is content, content is form. The container is the message it contains. It must itself persuade. Here are some more examples of lines Gass liked to quote in speaking about this persuasive music. A line from Racine's Phèdre, Le jour n'est pas plus pur que le fond de mon cœur. In English, daylight is not more pure than the depths of my heart. It sounds better in French, even in my lousy French. Or Rilke's lines, kannst du dir denn denken, dass ich Jahre so ein Fremde unter Fremden fahre? Gass translates these lines in his book Reading Rilke, Reflections on the Problems of Translation. Can you understand how much I've wandered, a stranger in a world of strangers, and now at last you take me home? These were no longer, Gass writes, effusions from feelings more imaginary than real, but lines linked by a thought, a music, tough as steel. So some of these lines that showed up in Gass's book on translating Rilke, he was already pondering, in the seminar more than a decade before. 11 years before. This was the sort of aesthetic rightness Valery, too, was always aiming for in his poems and dialogues, making the dialogues poetic objects, too, even if their contents were philosophical. The dialogue form, Gass liked to say, gave its author an occasion to think conversationally, providing a context and environment for talking. Unlike most philosophical essays in which the authors aim for invisibility to be, as Gass said, an idea speaking to an idea. Unlike Plato's dialogues, Valery's are non-argumentative. His characters state their opposing views without arguing, as if, this is Gass, the texts are just too pretty to ruin with arguings. I like that. The texts are just too pretty to ruin with arguings. All the characters speak equally well, and so it's impossible to know which one is representing the author's point of view. There's no speaker that isn't eloquent, leading one to suspect that all of them are in fact just different facets of Valery himself with, as Gass said, the idea ricocheting from one side of the soul to the other. I remember that I wrote my term paper that semester on Valery's Dialogue of the Tree, in which two characters named Tityrus and Lucretius, yes, that Lucretius, debate the differences between philosophy and song, i.e. poetry. The key line that stuck in my mind all this time is « Qu'est-ce que la parole une fois qu'elle chante? Elle y perd le pouvoir de poursuivre le vrai. » What is the word when it begins to sing? It then loses the power to follow truth. So we should suspect the poets, as Plato already said. The thing is that this line in French is stuck in the middle of a prose passage. The entire dialogue, in fact, is written in prose, but here Valery has his character, Tityrus, suddenly launch into iambic tetrameter, just as he is proclaiming that word that becomes song cannot possibly serve truth. Clearly, our man had a sense of humor. William McCausland Stewart, who translated the dialogues for the Princeton University Press edition, struggled with these lines. He writes, "What is the word, oh what, when it begins to sing? It loses in that act the power to follow truth." Well, those lines don't swing or sing, so the joke is lost. At any rate, the gulf between poetry and philosophy becomes ever narrower the longer the two figures converse. So where did the translation lessons come in? Let me put it this way. One of the many things I learned in Gass's seminar was how to read like a translator, by which I mean that he convinced me that the thickness and texture of the language, high modernist language in particular, and above all, its rhythm, was an inextricable part of every piece of writing that matters. And once you've digested this information, you basically know what you need to know to become a translator, assuming your foreign language and English language chops are both in order. The rest is practice and constant work, because hard as it is to translate in even a basic way, thinking only of communicating some basic notion of content, it's infinitely more difficult to do so while taking into account the particular way a text is embodied in its original language. And as befits a seminar exploring the work of Paul Valery, a writer and thinker obsessed with details, with the tiniest nuances of thought and art, we practice the closest of close readings, the sort that sets you thinking and speaking at great length about all the resonances and implications of particular phrases. Gass says this better than I could in the chapter of his Rilke book entitled Trance Reading, which was also already quoted from a bit this morning. When the line is a good one, there is a musical movement to its meaning which binds the line together as if it were one word, yet at the same time articulating, weighing, and apportioning the line's particular parts, the way syllables and their sounds and stresses spell a noun or verb, while throwing down a pattern of rhythm and meaning like a path to be pursued deeper into the stanza and resonating with what has preceded it, if anything has. These are not naturally harmonious functions, looking forward, listening back, uniting, and differentiating. This is from Gass's reading of Friedrich Hölderlin's short poem, Hälfte des Lebens, Half of Life, which we heard about a bit this morning also. Everybody's grabbed their favorite passages, and it seems we have some shared favorite passages. So Gass's reading of Hölderlin's poem, Hälfte des Lebens, Half of Life, in which he turns each line over and over, carefully hearing and considering, and then translating, since translation, as Gass writes, is reading of the best, the most essential kind. It makes sense that he's talking about this poem in a book about Rilke. Hölderlin, at the turn of the 19th century, was an important forebear for Rilke at the turn of the 20th. And this poem in particular, describing a landscape that feels strangely laden with significance, is clearly proto-Rilkean. This is one of the most beloved short poems in the German language canon, the sort that every translator does a version of sooner or later. I've had one filed away in my computer since the 1990s, pulling it out every now and again to give it a tweak. Want to hear what it looks like now? Here it is. Half of Life. With yellow pears the land, and thick with wild roses, hangs down to the lake. You lovely swans, and drunken with kisses, your heads you dip beneath the holy, sober water. But oh, where shall I find when winter comes the flowers, and where the sunshine and shades of the earth? The walls stand speechless and cold. In the wind, the weathercocks clatter. Oftentimes, a translation, especially of a poem, is a record of a particular reading. Here are the principal features of mine. I think of assonance as the glue holding the poem together, and its major movement is from up to down and then from down to up. The movement from pear trees to roses to shoreline to lake, and then even beneath the water's surface with the heads of the swans. This is a process of beneficent grounding. All the burgeoning life on earth is sympathetically linked and partakes of the sacred. Divinity lives in this lake. The swans baptize themselves in an outpouring of love. The famous word heilig nüchtern that Hölderlin uses to describe the water, it's what I translated here as holy sober, is one of those knots in the translation that one can tease away at for decades without success. Christopher Middleton, in his translation of the poem, has the swans dipping their heads into the holy, lucid water. In Michael Hamburger's version, it is the hallowed, the sober water. Gass writes, the holy, solemn water. Steering away from holy sober out of fear, he says, of inadvertently punning, maybe the only time in his entire literary career that he said no thank you to a pun, which only shows you what great respect he has for Hölderlin. I went with holy, sober, because first, I think the context prevents a jocular read. And secondly, I really want the long O sounds to knit up that first stanza from roses to sober. This heilig nüchtern is a perfect illustration of the translator's dilemma that often, in order to adequately represent everything a word is saying, you would have to say something far more complicated that would break the tone. Technically, the word heilig nüchtern doesn't mean heilig, holy, plus nüchtern, sober. It means holily or sacredly sober, or sober in a holy way, or so sober it's holy, or holy in its sobriety. Heilig is the holy of saints and silent night, holy night. And nüchtern is sober in various senses. It's the opposite of drunk, like the swans, and also the sober of rationality, as on sober reflection. Putting them together in such a way that one modifies the other is something that's grammatically very easy and convenient to do in German. And so writers readily take advantage of this. In English, it's hard. We have a tortured relationship to adverbs. We have a tortured relationship to adverbs, for one thing, perhaps because in English, adverbs usually have to have a pesky ly stuck on to the end of them, which can really muck up your sentence with superfluous curlicues. In German, it's the other way around. Adjectives get endings and adverbs get none. So folks writing German feel no particular urge to steer away from adverbs. For Hölderlin to have placed these two adjectives side by side, unlinked, he'd have had to add a syllable, giving the line's rhythm a hiccup. Ins heilig nüchterne Wasser would have been ins heilige nüchterne Wasser. In any case, I think we can all agree that sacredly sober water would stick out in this poem as conceptually clunky. In fact, one of the things that gives this poem its power in German is that it achieves all these striking effects while sticking to a very simple, basic vocabulary. Nothing fancy about any of its words. Even heilig nüchtern is still just two straightforward words stuck together. Pears, roses, land, lakes, swans, kisses, heads, water. You get the idea. It's nice that so many of these are nice, short words in English, too. Translation, then, is a way of reading while writing, a way of showing the reader of the translation what you saw in the poem. I'll venture to claim that the main reason why Half of Life is a poem translators are always wanting to try their hand at, besides the fact that it's one of the shortest of Hölderlin's non-fragment poems and doesn't rhyme, is that it's one of the ones least marked by the bizarre syntax that is Hölderlin's signature poetic move in much of his work, borrowed directly from Greek and sounding more Gerard Manley Hopkins-esque than Hopkins himself. This is why his works push the limits of translatability to such extremes. Of all the things most difficult to translate, I think nothing trumps syntax. Hölderlin writes line after line of words in the wrong order, wrong order, that seem weirdly luminous in the wrong sequence, while the same words properly sorted out might read as banal. One of my very favorite Hölderlin lines from the poem Blödigkeit, Stupefaction, goes like this: Gut auch sind und geschickt einem zu etwas wir, which in English literally would go, good to are and sent to someone for something we. The line in German is practically magical. Now I challenge you to come up with something good in English along the lines of, we too are good and have been sent to someone for some purpose. Sounds very poetical. I'm thinking that this translation puzzle will best be solved someday by someone who has steeped themselves in lines like, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal chestnut falls, finch's wings. That's from Hopkins' Pied Beauty. Go read Gerard Manley Hopkins if you have not read him. He's the most fantastic 19th century English poet. Because even though Hölderlin's verse is sparing in his use of both images and colorful vocabulary items, whereas Hopkins's poems are chaotically crowded with both of these writers understand the power of syntax and rhythm to shape a line, or even an idea, and for both of them, melody is everything. They both also write in praise of divinity. Gass's book on Rilke is crucial reading for translators because it demonstrates the amount of love and study that should ideally go into every translation. Gass writes about Rilke's life, both his literary and his romantic obsessions, and does close readings of a number of Rilke poems that include Gass's own translations that embody these readings in practical terms. In Half of Life, his consideration of the role of divinity in the poem leads to the daring suggestion of the adjective grace-shaped to describe the swans. The word is Hold in German. But as so often in translation, the translation of a single word draws from its context, and in this case, fulfills the compression called for in Heilig Nüchtern, 2 lines down. The word grace-shaped, it wouldn't be my own personal choice, but it is a powerful and interesting word. Think about the different ways in which grace is embodied in it. You have both grace as in divine grace and grace as in gracefulness. Swans that are shaped by grace, shaped by God's hand, shaped in gracefulness. And grace-shaped has that powerful, beautiful assonance I was talking about. It's a bold and very Gassian move. I'm going to read his poem. With yellow pears, the land, and full of wild roses, hangs down into the lake. You grace-shaped swans, drunk from kisses, you dip your heads into the holy, solemn water. Solemn is a nice choice. The holy, solemn water. Where shall I, when winter's here, find flowers, and where sunshine and shadows of earth? Walls stand speechless and cold. In the wind, weathercocks clatter. The translation as a whole is gorgeously compressed and pared down. Gass subtracts several thes that I kept in for concision, such that I began to think about William Carlos Williams and his ultra-svelte verse. There's also a hint of contemporary colloquialism, when winter's here, drunk from kisses, that claim this poem as a time traveler to the turn of our own century, a strong claim for the longevity of the state it describes. Critiquing translations by suggesting alternatives of his own, as Gass does throughout his book, but particularly in his chapter on the first Duino elegy, is a robust tradition whose first path-breaking practitioner in the history of modern literary translation, though you can certainly find older examples in the case of Bible translation, was the great German Romantic translator August Wilhelm Schlegel, who's best known for his translation of 17 of Shakespeare's plays, none of which, by the way, Ludwig Tieck collaborated with him on. So anyone who says the Schlegel-Tieck translations is perpetuating a misconception. Schlegel made translation criticism a genre by writing reviews of many dozens of translated works, mainly in the journal Allgemeine Literaturzeitung, translates as general literature newspaper, a daily newspaper devoted to literature, daily, founded in 1785, in which people like Goethe, Schiller, and Kant published. A daily newspaper devoted to literature? I mean, it wasn't hugely fat, but still. As part of many of his reviews that criticized the translations of works from many languages by many hands, Schlegel would offer his own retranslations of certain snippets to show how it could have been done better. And this was how he honed his own skills as a translator, inspired, as it were, by what he saw as the failings of others. I think this is the same impulse that causes people to be snarky on the internet. There was an article a couple years ago I read, apparently snarking on the internet activates the same pleasure center in your brain as cocaine. And fixing somebody else's translation, I think, may do the exactly same thing. 1 year before Schlegel published his first Shakespeare translation, which was Romeo und Julia, which appeared in 1896 in Schiller's Journal Die Horen, Schlegel wrote a review of Goethe's novel Wilhelm Meister, in which he spent some time critiquing the translation scene. For those of you who haven't read it recently, Goethe's own Willy Master decides to translate Hamlet, and he does so in prose, which comes more naturally to him than iambic pentameter, and also sets out to improve the text according to his own tastes and standards. He decides to trim some of the distracting background incidents, like the uprising in Norway, the war against Fortinbras, things like that. The only function of these incidents, as Goethe has Wilhelm explained, is to hold together the important scenes. They harm the unity of the play. I think he's taking Aristotle too literally. They are, in his words, gravely flawed. But no, Schlegel objects, and says what he wants to see instead. A poetic translation that would not erase any of the characteristic differences of form and would preserve Shakespeare's beauties insofar as possible, without ever presuming to give him others. A translation that would also translate the displeasing characteristics of his style, like having wars, I guess. Schlegel says this would admittedly be an undertaking of great difficulty, but one whose difficulties are not unsurmountable in our language. Schlegel eventually went on to publish his own translation of Hamlet, as well as 16 other Shakespeare plays that remain canonical in German, although there have been literally dozens of translations published since. They're still often performed, and if you see those little yellow reclam books that are used by students, they're the most often assigned edition for high school and university use because they're cheap and small and easy to carry around. Most of those are still Schlegel translations. Certainly, the plays that Schlegel translated still appear in that edition as in his translation. So with this, August Wilhelm Schlegel became the father of modern translation in the German language tradition, the first to write translations that really share the same goals that we take for granted when we translate today. That the translation be so detailed a representation of the original that each sentence, each phrase of the original is somehow accounted for in the translation, and that the translator not merely retell the story in his own terms, departing where he will from the original, but follow the original author's aesthetic strategy and stylistic lead. Translations done earlier into German, even famous ones, like the Shakespeare plays translated by the celebrated 18th century poet and playwright Christoph Martin Wieland in the 1760s, tended to be what we would now dismiss as paraphrase, at best adaptations. But in this age of the paraphrase, the translator did at least count as an author in his own right, something that increasingly ceased to be the case once a more docile form of translation became the norm, with the translator at pains to be as good a mime as possible. Eventually, this trend brought us the age of the translator's invisibility, now much decried, that we are currently doing our best to emerge from. Gas, for one, was never much for invisibility. just as in his own writing, in which his characteristic style always stands out, he translates with a very strong voice. Never, he writes of Rilke's archaic torso of Apollo, never will we know his legendary head where the apple's eyes slowly ripened. Yet his torso glows as if his look were set above it in suspended globes that shed a street's light down. The images are all Rilke. Yes, even turning the eyes apples, which is how Germans say eyeballs, into a literal image with the verb ripen. And the notion that the light a street light casts is a street's light is 100% gas. Indeed, strong translations is what a poet like Rilke needs at this point. He's been translated dozens of times in all sorts of namby-pamby ways by all sorts of excellent translators who have struggled with his difficulty and thus turned out poems in English that are in one way or the other less than. I myself have had a version of The Panther going on my computer for a good 15 years now, and it's still not done. And we're talking about a measly dozen lines. But it's just that difficult to translate poetry that was built around the framework of a rhyme scheme, propped up by the scaffolding of significance-implying sound patterns. The poem can rise to glittering heights and still feel substantial. The only one who can do it regularly and make it look easy is Richard Wilbur. I don't know if you know his translations, from all kinds of languages. He's translating from Russian, I think, with informants, certainly from French. He translated all the Molière plays. But Richard Wilbur is somebody who rhymes with such facility. I think I read somewhere that he, at one point, started writing the rough drafts of his own poem in prose form to try and break himself of writing too rhythmically and too rhymedly. Maybe you have to be him to manage this in rhymes all the time. In any case, but a poem that was written with rhymes and with rhythm is built around these sound structures, these rhythmical structures. And when you take them away, when your translation lacks those defining vowels, a poem can so quickly become saggy or soggy, bloated and washed out. Sometimes the translator is fortunate and skilled and can find rhymes that fit tidily into the poem and work without intruding. And I think Gass has some very beautiful rhymes in this archaic torso. More often, the rhymes must be relinquished, even though this costs the poem much of its internal glue. Fortunately, we can triangulate between translations. There's nothing like reading 3 or 4 different translations of a poem that get almost there to get a sense of what a poem really is. And how do we get all the way there to the poem in English that perfectly embodies the rhymed foreign language poem in all its sensuality? It's a goal, oh look, I'm repeating myself. Well, I'm so sorry, tough. It's a goal almost impossible to attain. There just aren't that many translated rhymed poems that completely knock your socks off the way a stunning poem in its original language can. When my students start to give up hope, I make them my own, I give them my own personal despair reducer, which is Richard Wilbur's translation of Anna Akhmatova's poem, Lot's Wife. After they've read that one, they usually stop despairing and get back to work because it can be done. It's just that it's seriously difficult. The last line of that poem is, Lot's wife, the one who turned into a pillar of salt, who for one look back gave up her life, is how he ends this translation. It's like hauntingly beautiful. And then, of course, there are so many ways that there's so many ways of brilliantly translating poetry, rhymed or unrhymed. I have a particular weakness for what often gets called experimental translation, as if all translation weren't experimental, in which translated poems get incorporated into new ones such that the new work is simultaneously a translation and a poem of its own. Mary Jo Bang's luscious Inferno is such a work. So is Christian Hawkey's Ventricle. I teach both of these and love them both so much. As translators, we always have to be thinking about how to embody the work fully with our breath, our words. Once I had the opportunity to talk to the great actor and playwright Wallace Shawn about how he did what he does, speaking in particular of his performance in Louis Malle's spectacular film Vanya on 42nd Street, which among other things documents a Chekhov project Sean had been working on for decades with Andrei Gregory and other actor friends. Sean's performance in the film is utterly seamless. In the opening scene, you see the various actors arriving at the theater with their morning coffee, and Sean begins to talk about his day has been going and what he experienced on his way to the theater. And after he's been at it for a little while, you realize that he's been speaking the lines of Chekhov's play for quite some time without any obvious transition. And that's because he's found a way to make the lines so much his own that these lines are just how he talks. And listening to him, you believe it's how he talks. That's the sort of perfect ventriloquism we seek in translation too. When I asked Sean how he did it, he said, "It's because we'd been working on the project for so many years. Each of us had the chance to work over every last detail of our performance until it was just right. It wasn't just inspiration, it was months and months of rehearsal work." And all that work produced a sense of effortlessness. Translated into the world of translation, this is called revision. There's no such thing as too much of it. It's hard for me to stop revising when I'm finishing a book. I revise page proofs. And if my publisher is foolish enough to send me second proofs, I revise the second proofs too. The book that's just coming out in November, Yoko Tawada's, coming full circle back to Tawada at New Directions, Yoko Tawada's novel Études im Schnee, which is coming out as Memoirs of a Polar Bear. New Directions actually sent me third proofs. I'm so embarrassed. But what I'm revising for over and over again is that sense of rightness of a phrase, that illusion of effortlessness that sells the phrase as truth-telling, or at least disbelief suspending. It's this Valerian sense of discipline and devotion to the fine-tuning, or really just the tuning, of a sentence that for which I'm most grateful to William Gass as a teacher. It served me very well, and it's probably the most important thing I try to communicate to my own students in my translation classroom. My students are always hearing me say things like, "Turn up the volume on that phrase," meaning that they've written it in too bland a way for the work it needs to be doing in its sentence. Or, "Sell that better," meaning that the natural stresses of the sentence they've written aren't falling in a way that allows the reader to feel the most important word or phrase to be the most important. Because in prose, as in poetry, there are strong and weak placements for words based on the particular cadences at work. Or, "That word isn't paying its way in the sentence," meaning trim away the dead weight. There are so many ways to think about shaping lines and sentences, and ideally, a translator is thinking of all of them at the same time. Let me give one example of how these principles get applied when I'm revising my own work. I had a particularly hard time with the final sentence of the prose piece New Year's Page, Neujahrsblatt, by Robert Walser. Since this was to be the last piece in the collection Microscripts, the sentence had to be strong enough to end not just the story, but also the book. New Year's Page concludes with an observation about the relationship between endings and beginnings. In my third or fourth draft, the final sentences went like this: "When a year stops, another instantly commences, as if one were turning the page. The story keeps on going, and we see the beauty that lies in connectedness." The final phrase of that last sentence, "we see the beauty that lies in connectedness," was my attempt to render the line, "Und man sieht die Schönheit eines Zusammenhangs." The word Zusammenhang, literally context or connection, in a sense not involving human relationships, because German has a different word for that, Beziehungen, proved surprisingly recalcitrant. For the very first draft I had tried, "and we see the beauty of a context," a quite literal rendering of the original, but it didn't make rhythmical sense as the ending of a sentence, much less a story or book. What I wanted was a phrase that would work in the manner of Wallace Stevens's lines, "I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling, or just after." For a long time I played with variations on this theme, such as, We see the beauty of contextuality, the beauty of contiguity. Can't even say that. The beauty of contiguity. But all these variants sounded too academic and tricky. So I tried other approaches. The beauty of having a context, the beauty given us by context, the beauty of things in context, the beauty of things in their contexts. Can you sense the desperation? None of these phrases was right. It just didn't seem plausible that someone would have chosen to write these phrases in English in this way. So I let go of the word context and tried out other possibilities. And we see what is beautiful about contiguity. And we see what is so beautiful about contiguity. And we experience the loveliness, the beauty of contiguity. But contiguity, which I can't even pronounce and don't like, wasn't really the right choice since it refers more to the continuousness or close proximity of objects to one another, and not so much to the fact that taken together they form a context or whole. So I tried, and we experience the beauty of continuation. Well, that's similarly problematic. And then the beauty of connection. But the problem with connection is the same as with the beauty of connectedness. In each case, human connection is implied rather than the things of the world joining together to constitute a context within which humans exist and act. So I tried yet another approach, one that would refocus attention on the things, the beauty of linking things together, contextual beauty, the beauty of putting things in context, the beauty of things linked together, the beauty of things conjoined. I liked these a bit better, but they all ended a bit too abruptly. None felt dramatic enough to serve as a final phrase for the story. It wasn't until I'd puttered around in this sentence for several weeks that it occurred to me in a moment of inspiration, don't tell Valery, that I could solve the problem by recasting the sentence entirely. What I realized was that the main difficulty with the word context was that it wasn't a rhythmically appropriate word to end the sentence on. If I could rearrange the final part of the sentence, I thought maybe the cadence might be differently balanced. So I decided to try thinking of the man sieht backwards, not as we see, as I'd rendered it without much deliberation, but as is seen by us. This would make context the subject rather than the object of its phrase, and then that word would no longer have to conclude the English sentence, because English syntax, as anyone who's tried translating from more syntactically flexible languages, English syntax does not budge. Like in German, you can say, I gave the man the hat, and you can put the words I, man, and hat in any order you like, and the sentence still works out, whereas in English, I gave the hat the man obviously means something different. In English, we're sort of in a cage of syntax, which is hard when you're translating, one of the many things that is hard. So I tried, when I decided to make the subject the object and the object the subject, I tried, the story keeps on going and the beauty of a context appears to us. Or, the story keeps on going and the beauty of a context reveals itself. These were all better, but near misses. And then it occurred to me to try the passive voice, and the beauty of a context is revealed. And all of a sudden, the tumblers of the safe I'd been doggedly attempting to crack suddenly slid into alignment and the safe opened. It was immediately obvious how much better this version was. For one thing, the story and book now ended on the suggestive, luminous word revealed, with a stress on the final syllable to underscore the finality. For another, the phrase was now ambiguous in the same way as Walser's German, with the words a context, referring both to contexts in general and to the particular context at hand. When a year stops, another instantly commences, as if one were turning the page. The story keeps on going, and the beauty of a context is revealed. I was happy with those 8 words, but no reader of the book will have the slightest idea how much labor went into them, except you. Oh, and there's one more story I really have to tell you before I wrap this up, because it's getting late, I think. When I first came to Washington University, I was just 22 years old, I'd graduated a year early from Hopkins because that was a good way to save money and because I was stupid and thought, oh, let's get through this as soon as possible, which means I missed out on studying with X, Y, and Z people I, now admire so greatly, But then I spent a year in Zurich on a Fulbright-type grant translating a book of stories by Robert Walser that miraculously Johns Hopkins University Press decided to publish. So when I arrived on the Washington University campus in the fall, I had a book contract in hand, insanely. And out of some kind of crazy, misguided chutzpah, I marched myself into Professor Gass's office and asked him if he would write the introduction to this collection of stories. I just didn't know any better. I was a kid. I already knew he liked Walser's work because I'd sat in on one of his classes the year before when I'd come to campus to interview for a fellowship. Thank you, Olin Fellowship Program. You made possible my studies here. And Walser was right there on the syllabus next to Kafka. I still can't believe I walked in his office and asked him that. It was outrageous. And I still can't believe that without a moment's hesitation, he said yes. It was an act of extreme kindness and generosity to a young person, for which I'll always be grateful. And he wrote one of the most beautiful appreciations I've ever read of Walser's writing. Speaking of Walser's late work, Gass writes, and I'm going to end on this, and it's all one sentence what I'm about to read, but it is easier now in the late work than in his earlier work. It is easier now to follow the inner flow beneath these scraps of language, to appreciate the simple clarity of the sentences he has constructed, to recognize that these meditations, for they have never been anything else, move not in the manner of events or in the manner of a river or in the manner either of thought or in the happy hour fashion of the told tale, each brought so beautifully together in Boat Trip, one of the triumphs of Walser's art, but in the way of an almost inarticulate metaphysical feeling, a response to the moves and meanings of both human life and nature, which is purged of every local note and self-interested particularity, and which achieves, like the purest poetry, an understanding mix of longing, appreciation, and despair, as if they were the pigments composing a color to lay down upon the surface of something passing, sweetly regretful, like the fall of light upon a bit of lost water, or a brief gleam caught in a fold of twilit snow, as if it were going to remain there forever. Thank you.